In 1987, Colin Wallace was released from prison.
A journalist called Julian O'Halloran went to Lewis Prison, actually filmed Colin Wallace as he stepped out of the prison gate and interviewed him. And it was going to be broadcast on Newsnight. I was actually watching Newsnight when there was a great kerfuffle in the studio. Something had happened and bits of paper were being looked at and headphones were being checked. And what had happened was the Wallace segment had been yanked at the last minute by a man called Alan Prothero, who at that point was deputy director of the BBC. Prothero was a part-time army officer in the Territorial Army, and his speciality was media-military relations. I went down to visit him and Fred, and it was the middle of winter. We were sitting in Colin Wallace's unheated house. He'd come out of prison and he couldn't afford to heat it. And so we were all sitting in our coats in Colin's living room, and I remember saying something like, "So your plan is that me and you two guys with no money between us are going to take on MI5 and the MOD?" "Yes, that's the plan," they said.
Irish broadcaster RTE picked up the story.
The record says that Colin Wallace killed Jonathan Lewis.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Did you?
No, I didn't. I had nothing at all to do with his death. I wasn't involved in any way. But I mean, if I'm not calm about it, if I panic about it, I create a fuss, I get excited about it, that's not going to change the verdict any quicker than if I stay calm and deal with it properly through the correct channels.
Eventually I was hired by Channel 4 News. Colin had these handwritten notes that he claimed he'd written down from about this MI5 disinformation project mostly against Labour MPs. Robert Parker of Channel 4 News went to a forensic scientist called Dr. Julius Grant.
What chances do you think there are that these notes are forgeries?
Well, from what I've already said, the chances that they're forgeries seem to be rather remote.
And thus these documents were in fact written, probably when Wallace said they were written. While we were working together on bits and pieces about Wallace, another journalist in ITN, who was one of their crime correspondents, began feeding information he was getting from the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, denigrating Wallace. We were also getting similar stuff from Professor Paul Wilkinson, a terrorism expert, again denigrating Wallace and saying he's a fantasist and a liar.
Investigative journalist Paul Foote wrote a book about Colin Wallace. Wallace began to appear in the British media more frequently, including on popular ITV weekly debate show Central Weekend Live.
If you take the case of Mr. Wallace here, as everybody else who's ever convicted of any crime, poor Mr. Wallace was framed. I don't believe he was framed.
The point that he made.
Any responsible journalist in Northern Ireland in the early 70s knew what Colin Wallace was up to. There was this gung-ho character who was running around at dead of night, shoving envelopes full of documents into the letterboxes of journalists. And you'd say, there's Colin's at it again.
I, for one, I was probably the first person in the CIA who got into this dirty tricks business. They weren't as dirty as a lot of people think.
Yeah, because a lot of people find it very objectionable.
But it wasn't just a minute. It's to blacken someone's a hell of a lot better than killing. In World War II, we killed people. And then now, when we got into business, well, we were simply playing dirty tricks to prevent having World War III.
You're the man that sparked all this off.
I did not join the security forces to discredit the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party. And because I was deflected from my main job into doing political disinformation, I was not actually doing the job I joined to do.
Good evening. A civil servant sacked after making allegations about an MI5 dirty tricks campaign has been awarded £30,000 compensation by the government.
Calcutt QC was asked to conduct an inquiry. In his report, he reveals that Ministry of Defence officials contacted Mr. Wallace's disciplinary hearing beforehand, thus influencing the outcome. The Defence Secretary, Tom King, asked Mr. Calcutt not to write a full report.
Labour's Northern Ireland Secretary between 1974 and 76 said he had been the victim of a dirty tricks campaign.
Who instructed Mr. Wallace to do the job that he and others did? That's what we've got to know. We want to be sure that this sort of thing never happens again. I feel very strongly about it.
Mrs. Thatcher, having insisted there was no evidence to back such claims, was forced to admit in the Commons that she'd been misled. This followed the discovery of documents in the Ministry of Defence which related to a propaganda campaign codenamed Clockwork Orange.
He's calling for the government to launch a full inquiry.
And justice to me is really a minor matter. The much more important matters are the allegations that there was an attempt to influence the general elections in 1974, and indeed the assaults on the children in Concora during the 70s. My aspect of the story really is only a minor one by comparison.
The government specifically ruled out the reopening of the investigation into the alleged cover-up of the homosexual abuse of boys at the Concora home in Belfast.
Information about homosexual behaviour at the Concora boys' home was used to blackmail prominent figures in Northern Ireland.
After I left Northern Ireland, another intelligence officer who came in called Brian Gimmel, he was told about the allegations surrounding the abuses at Concora. He wrote a report about them. He submitted that report to a senior MI5 officer, Ian Cameron, who then told him to stop investigating.
You know, on the phone we got phone calls of generals said, yes, I knew all about Concora, I was told, and I took it to MI5 and they said it was none of my business and I left it to them, it was their business. And all this sort of stuff, and you know, the realisation, like me, the light is dawning, that we are not who we say we are.
Journalist David Lay tracks down Dennis Payne, the former head of MI5 in Northern Ireland, to a sleepy village in the countryside, and confronted him with the Clockwork Orange allegations.
I'm under no obligation to say absolutely nothing. I can't say anything at all. I mean, you collect all the information. I can't believe it isn't the slightest bit interest in it, but I've nothing to add.
In 1996, Colin Wallace appealed his conviction for manslaughter.
Today, 15 years after he was jailed for manslaughter, Colin Wallace from West Sussex cleared his name.
He served 6 years in the 1980s after being found guilty of killing an antiques dealer near his home in West Sussex.
During the appeal hearing, the Home Office pathologist admitted that a Secret Service agent had suggested to him that the injury was caused by a karate chop to the head and not from the propeller of a boat.
The hearing at the Court of Appeal focused largely on new medical evidence about the injury Jonathan Lewis received.
Jonathan Lewis was most probably attacked at the riverbank and not at his house. And he said there was no evidence that his body had ever been in Colin Wallace's car.
He says he was the victim of an MI5 dirty tricks campaign. Now Mr. Wallace is demanding a full investigation into his claims.
Even after Colin Wallace received compensation, his troubles with MI5 were not over.
When I was working at BIA, MI5 contacted the head of security there, and then I was made redundant after that. Now, I can't say MI5 was responsible, but again, why were they still meddling in my case after all those years?
Right. There's many aspects of what I've termed the deception industrial complex that I've not touched on in this mini-series, and that's purely for brevity's sake and to try and keep the overall flow sort of more concise and not endlessly running. Wanted to keep this mini-series to as few episodes as I possibly could and cover some of what I felt were the more important aspects and the easiest for people to get their heads around. But there is far more. This is why I set up the Telegram group specifically to put all the documentation and all the evidence I'd built up onto for people to easily find it. What I mean by that is stuff like the digital ghettos is one. the social media platforms where people were being funneled to after maybe getting banned off YouTube or Twitter or Facebook and what have you. And these are platforms deliberately set up as echo chambers in a way. Where you only hear one specific side of something, basically funneled into there and constantly fed the same information over and over again, putting you into a sort of self-contained, self-imposed ecosystem of self-indoctrination. Well, there's self in there, but that's essentially what they're for. And these are basically to help not only monitor and track the those accounts that have been banned off other platforms with a particular point of view, but they're also places where you could call them gatekeepers, I suppose, or popular accounts within these groups that are also agents. Now, not all of them are, don't get me wrong, but the vast majority are, and they're there to keep things simmering and at a regular level until such time that they're needed to sort of ignite the flame underneath them and mobilise them for scapegoating, basically, something to blame them. She was a good example of this. Didn't necessarily start out as a military or as a psyop. I've gone through Q so many times, but it has been utilised by these intelligence agencies quite a lot. We find them quite easy to manipulate and steer, much to the chagrin of the actual people that are running it. That's just one aspect. One aspect that I didn't cover, and there's also the increase in censorship, but a bizarre kind of censorship where certain things that you would expect to be censored, largely censored, are allowed to filter through, and other opinions aren't. You begin to wonder why that is. Well, again, this is more of the same game. It's become very apparent that when you're looking into this sort of thing, and many of you all know this already, but none of the wars that we see are organic. No terrorist organisation is truly a terrorist organisation, and very often they're intelligence led. Honeypots aren't the sole tactic of a single entity, as many people would like you to believe, as you could see by the first clip that I began with, which is from a documentary that I highly recommend called the Man Who Knew Too Much, about, and his name escapes me, it always escapes me, but I'll put it across the bottom, who was a British military intelligence officer who was in charge of a lot of the propaganda programmes that was going on in Northern Ireland, and his realisation that these honeypots existed mainly in care homes, backlash and destruction of his life that was basically perpetrated by MI6, the very organisation that he worked for, simply because he didn't want anything to do with it anymore. This is an ongoing thing all over the place. It's not just tied to one sort of intelligence agency or nation. Bear in mind also that Jeffrey Epstein, although, yeah, he did work for Mossad, he also worked for the CIA and MI6. His loyalties basically lay with whoever had the biggest wallet. And very often, I know many of you won't like to hear this, but very often it was UK and US intelligence. He was a double agent to an extent, but like I said, he had his... It was basically utilised by everybody. Highest bidder, as is very often the case. But the Northern Ireland situation should give you an idea that it's not just based to one sort of... It's not a solely Mossad idea. Although yes, they have connections with Epstein, that's undeniable. But so does every other intelligence-led organisation. And if you read the documentation, Mossad and the Israeli government aren't as powerful as people like to believe. You very quickly realise that they're in fact a tool of the Western intelligence organisations. What used to be Five Eyes but is now Nine Eyes, because now we've included Finland, Sweden, Norway and Italy into that game, and to some extent France. But oh, sorry. Yeah. It is. Sweden, Norway, Finland, Italy, yeah. So it will become 10 eyes at some point, 11 eyes when they integrate even more. I mean, there's a reason why the EU are so desperate to take a hold of the UK's military and intelligence infrastructure, because they're the best in the world. It's actually that simple. Gives them access to a lot and makes them have probably the most powerful military and most powerful intelligence arm in the world.
Robbins of blessed memory, Mrs May's former EU chief at number 10. Brockbank gained notoriety from the publication of the Kit Kat tapes, which you may have heard of. On the 15th of March 2018, the Sun newspaper published explosive extracts from a secret tape recording that had been made of British officials addressing a group of EU officials. First, we hear a British official called Victoria Billing from Deus chuckle as she describes how British officials go through the motions of making a chocolate coating that superficially conforms to the Brexit mandate, while actually baking a layered biscuit of the sort of integrative agreements that Jonathan has been rehearsing, and which were actually listed in the Deus Closer Union paper of September 2017.
On our side, on the Trump Political Defence, we're actually looking for something which I normally call a patchwork, but somebody yesterday called a Kit Kat, which I rather liked, where you have the kind of cover of you have the kind of political framework cover, but underneath you have a series of different agreements.
And then on the full Kit Kat tapes, that's why they're called the Kit Kat tapes, because she's talking about a Kit Kat bar. On the full tapes, which the Sun allowed me to have, and which I published on our Briefings for Brexit website as an annex to an essay which I wrote called Leaving Hotel California, that you can find there, we hear Alistair Brockbank from the May cell, because he's one of this close coterie of the former Prime Minister, making extraordinary statements. He says, I quote from the tapes, "Where we think things should be and set out in their guidelines is that there should be no gap on CFSP or CSDP on exit day." He regrets our absence from PESCO, the main organ of defence union, as you have been told, and he says, quote, "We would see what we can contribute towards PESCO still," as the EU moves it forward. Of the list of acronymic EU defence institutions, the EDF and the EDRP and the EDIDP and so on, he states that, quote, "On the capabilities side, we are interested in it all." He wants to remain in CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review, whose mechanism Jonathan described. He even talks about the UK retaining a seat on the UK's negotiating bodies, while aware that only a proximity role might be possible, and he suggests that the ERSAT's European Foreign Ministry, the EEAS, might have people placed inside British government ministries after Brexit. Like Ms. Billing, Mr. Brockbank cynically boasts that it is civil servants who are, I quote, "negotiating the detail of that at the same time as we are discussing the political high-level fluffy bits," his words, "that will go into any declaration that's made public." In other words, that's wool to be pulled over the people's eyes. He states that the ambition is to lock the UK into and under EU control in the defence, security and intelligence areas by an international treaty as soon as possible after leaving day, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that Sir Richard and Lord Guthrie and I prepared the draft treaty with the help of international lawyers, which is now there tabled and indeed available to Number 10 to roll the day after we leave. It's a protective treaty, as distinct from a destructive and colonial treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, to the best of my knowledge, which is of course limited, that's merely of an outsider, Mr. Brockbank has been neither censured nor sacked by the past and continuing Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor, Sir Mark Sedwill. Senior to Brockbank, by far, are a man already mentioned, Mr. Angus Lapsley, recently honoured in the Queen's Birthday Honours, and Dr. Brian Wells. Both of them are now senior in the Ministry of Defence. Lapsley is on record in 2016 when he was the UK's ambassador to the EU Political and Security Committee, telling his fellow ambassadors on a charming away day in the Alps, which is the sort of thing ambassadors do, because after all it's very hard work and you do need to go to the Alps quite a lot, that he didn't understand why his country had voted to leave the EU. Ich verstehe nicht, he said. Bizarrely, he declared in the same remarks that EU foreign policy had always been relatively popular in the UK, and that we rather like the security strategy, we rather like the global strategy. We were part of the member states who helped to shape it. Yes, indeed, we were. He was, I think, probably one of those involved. We think it's a good strategy. The we is clearly first-person singular. Mr. Lapsley has tweeted subsequently that the EU Commission is needed if we're to respond to modern threats in Europe, and as General Jonathan mentioned when he was mentioning him, he explicitly diverges from the normal view that defence is a sovereign responsibility of sovereign states. He believes that it shouldn't be, and that the EU should run our defence. And this gentleman is now an MOD director in charge of negotiating, still today, as we sit here, just behind us in this building. His fellow co-worker is Dr. Brian Wells, who is in charge of science and technology in the building behind us. Dr. Wells has had a long career. He and I coincided once when I too was working in the Defence Research Agency, and he also. Subsequently, he's worked for the EU, he worked for Mogherini and the European Defence Agency, and has repeatedly been, he's on the record, encouraging UK defence companies to engage in the drive towards EU defence union. So, to put it in its mildest, both of these men show strong signs of EU institutional capture. And they're British civil servants, serving British civil servants at a high level. People such as these three, evincing such views, ought, in my modest view, as a matter of priority, at the very least, to be transferred to posts unrelated to the EU, and replaced by civil servants of a more traditional stripe, less willing to declare themselves politically and truculently at odds with the people's instructions, and less likely to acquiesce in the anti-Anglosphere wrecking conduct that is embodied in May's toxic treaty text. It is therefore encouraging to see how far and how vigorously already the brooms have been sweeping in the few short weeks of the incoming government. My wish in pointing to these three key individuals is merely to observe that the task is not yet complete in those areas which are, in fact, as all three of us have said, the most central to the primary duty of a sovereign government.
There's the emergence of AI. I mean, there's also the use. I mean, we already have the manipulation of the media that we have to sort of use a great deal of discernment with to pick out the truth from. But we also have the manipulation of social media as well. You can't trust video content. A great deal of the time, and this is to do with atrocity propaganda that I mildly touched on, and something that maybe I should have touched on a bit more, but it's essentially what we're being flooded with now to boost a certain narrative, to create a situation that will come to one foregone conclusion, that being the West versus the Islamic world, which will of course tie in Russia and China. This is what's essentially being proposed. We have the emergence of AI that's going to make our job even more difficult. And then there's all the censorship on top. There's what's coming. There's all the fear mongering. There's so much. There's ritualistic aspects of it that maybe I should have touched on, but I felt was likely something that for anyone that's new to this would find difficult to get their head around, and maybe something that I will perhaps consider touching on in the future if it's something people want. So what can we do? Why have I done this series? I've done it mostly to get people to think, to look at the world around them, to see where things aren't as they always initially appear. That the vast majority of what goes on in the world is engineered to go that way. That it involves mostly military psyop and cyber warfare and kind of spec op units. It's just the red cells. Coups, the uprisings, the rebellions, the insurgencies, the terrorist organisations, all of them aren't organic. A great deal of them don't actually exist either. The IRA is one example where at least 80 to 90% of the upper echelon were all MI6 assets. Either MI6 agents or assets working for MI6. The same could be said for Hamas, where they were deliberately set up by red cell units. Very likely E Squadron. The same with the Syrian, well, we know that for a fact with ISIS. ISIS don't exist. How can their leader die 4 times in the space of 6 years? The deputy of ISIS died twice. Yeah? Once in 2017, once in 2022. al-Baghdadi died 4 times, once in 2014, once in 2015, once in 2016 and once in 2020. See how it doesn't add up. All of this, all of that, with ISIS, the conception and the instigation of that programme is all detailed in the documents I have on that group. They're all official Pentagon and Rand Corporation, that are a military think tank, basically, still part of the military industrial complex, and also British intelligence as well, that are involved in all of those papers being written up and basically outlining how they were going to create and propagate ISIS. It's a completely fictional entity. This aspect of it needs to be understood more than anything, especially now with what's going on in Israel after October the 7th. This war that Israel is fighting against Gaza has many different sort of aspects to it. Again, it's all engineered. Not only because Netanyahu was pretty much losing control of the Israeli people, the Israeli population, but there was also a need for money laundering, as funneling it through Ukraine wasn't enough. What do I mean? Because of YouTube, I can't tell you directly, but look into Moderna. Look at who bought their vaccine division and became their largest shareholder and controlling shareholder in 2020, after 4 years of negotiations. Once you realise that Moderna and Pfizer use the same technology, and that Pfizer actually pays Moderna royalties for using that technology, and the same goes for every single other company, nation, whatever, that uses mRNA technology in the production methods, they also pay royalties to Moderna. You'll begin to understand why such a large money laundering operation was needed, and why they've needed to funnel it through Israel now. This a great many of you have been led to believe a certain narrative that is false. And despite what many of us try to tell you and try to point out the flaws in your narrative, you elect to disbelieve it because it doesn't fit in. And again, that goes back to the echo chambers and the ghettos, the online ghettos. Again, this is something else that I'm not entirely sure I can mention on YouTube, but you can get a general idea of where I'm going with this. People tend to forget how long organisations like MI6 have been around, who they've helped set up, yeah, or which nations have helped set up their own intelligence infrastructure, who they've trained. It may surprise many of you to know that the UK in general not only trains a great deal of the special forces around the world, with the SAS, who are still And you can ask any sort of special forces unit anywhere, and they will all turn around and say the SAS is the best by far. Best trained, best equipped, most experienced. Because they are, and they train everybody. And we also export our intelligence units. MI6 also trains every single unit around the world and helps set up near enough every single intelligence unit around the world. Again, those documents on that group will tell you all this. They are the most well funded, has the most robust infrastructure, yet we're discounted a great deal of the time because of a certain sort of antagonism to a particular nation and a particular intelligence agency of that nation. If we're going to progress, if we're going to break free of this control grid, we need to understand that a great deal of what we've been told and what we're led to believe isn't true, and hasn't been for a very long time. I am not admonishing this particular people and nation of a great deal of what they've done, because they've done some horrendous things. But at the same time, you have to consider how much of that is a psyop. How much of that is propaganda? How much of that have you been led to understand as true, when in actual fact, none of it is? I made a video called, it was one of my partly political rants called Don't Believe Your Lying Eyes. And in that video I broke down 2 Hamas videos that were supposedly of Israeli war crimes. One of them I couldn't fully show, but I could show screenshots of. And a great many people would recognise where those screenshots came from. Both of those videos were faked by Hamas to place blame or to create a false narrative that many in other Western nations who were protesting at the time would believe as being real, when in actual fact they were anything but. This isn't a new thing, or something that's not been done many times before. You know, you try and make a video and then you get interrupted, don't you?
Yes.
Yes. It'll be in the next one, right? Well, this series has been a bit complicated, and something that I didn't really want him to hear. Not yet, anyway. He's not old enough. Right now, the rise and the freedom to talk about a particular demographic and their genocide on all social media should be a red flag. They did the same thing during the COVID pandemic. when they allowed Q to filter through, and Q traffic, if you notice, went up about 150-200%, right? During the first few weeks. And this was so they could attach themselves to the sort of COVID questioning narrative, yeah, or the truth, as people like to call it. And then the same thing happened with the vaccines. Again, big. You'll notice a pattern, right? Let's put it this way. 2020, March, Q traffic went up. All these big channels, yeah. They all started picking it apart, attaching themselves and attaching the Q banner to people that were trying to get people to understand that what they were seeing wasn't real, right? A few weeks after, they're gone, yeah, deleted. But they allowed them to fester and to propagate for a while and then drag everyone off to the digital ghettos like BitChute, like Rumble. I'm sorry to say, but Rumble is as well, Odyssey, yeah, Minds, even Telegram, yeah. Then, when the vaccines started to come out, yeah, all these sort of, not massive, but slightly smaller sort of YouTube channels, well, YouTube Q channels with slightly more batshit crazy ideas were allowed to filter through, to propagate, to grow. Bump. A few weeks later, they're gone into the digital ghettos, BitChute, Rumble, Odyssey, Minds, Telegram, yeah, WhatsApp, Signal. There is a reason, right, why those platforms aren't allowed to grow too big. They have all together, yeah, all together, 5 to 6% of the market. The rest is run by Google, Twitter, and Facebook, or Meta as it's called, and Twitter X. I won't call it X. And although Rumble is gaining traction, it's still not going to be able to break into that market. It won't be allowed to. This is by design. Again, although they may not intentionally be, they are essentially a digital ghetto and are being allowed to remain as such. Outfits like BitChute, obviously, are deliberate digital ghettos, which is why you see only certain opinions on those platforms. Telegram's pretty much the same, although I advocate for it, yeah, and it is a good place to give all your information over, you know, store information and everything else, and it's still, at the end of the day, considered a digital ghetto. Although pages like mine and a few others that are propping up all over the place are allowing people to say what they like. And they don't like that. They don't like that at all. It kind of messes with the narrative, because people like me can question people from the BitChute pages. Anyway, it's beside the point. It's also why we've been attacked quite a lot lately. Essentially, we need more discourse. We need more people actually looking and seeing and breaking away from the usual narratives and seeing with new eyes. Same with controlled opposition. This is another thing that's been bandied around so much that it's now become the akin to being called racist or Nazi these days. It means nothing. And again, this is by design. Everyone who doesn't agree with a certain person is then deemed controlled opposition because they don't agree with them. Yeah, people. A great many people don't like having their views questioned or picked apart. Nobody does it at the end of the day, but it needs doing. It's a necessary part of actually growing your opinion. Questioning what you believe, putting it out there against other people's beliefs that may counter yours. It's a necessary part of the evolution of finding the truth. I said in a post the other day on Telegram that free speech is a must. There is no nuance, there is nothing behind it. Free speech means exactly that, the right to speak freely. With that comes free debate. You must be able to air your views, air your grievances, and people must be able to challenge those views and challenge those grievances and respond. Without that, they fester and poison that eventual opinion or belief until it becomes toxic to that person. It becomes a cancer within that person. It does. And within the movement itself, and will eat it alive from within. So everything must be questioned, everything must be debated, everything needs to be questioned and debated, even everything that I say, right? Everything you hear that you've heard today, or throughout my series, or throughout my channel, or even on my Telegram pages, question them, pick them apart. You may actually get me to think another way, you never know. But it needs doing. People need the courage to do that. And hopefully I'm enabling people to be able to. Because too often the label of controlled opposition is bandied around, and it puts people off people that may actually have a better idea of what's going on than the person who's calling them controlled opposition. Same with insiders. People come from take COVID as an example. I've had people like Mike Eden, Geert van den Bosch, John Campbell. All of them have come from a position of medical authority. Yeah? In the case of John Campbell, he was a lecturer, university lecturer in nursing. It was a profession that he'd been in for 50 years and loved and trusted and was part of who he was. And he had to be ripped from that opinion, from that belief. And you could see that it crushed him, but many people turn around and say he's controlled. Why is he controlled? Have you ever made a mistake? Have you ever tried to redeem yourself from that mistake? Has anyone ever called you controlled for doing that? This is the mentality you need to think of. You need to get into your head. Not everybody out there is controlled opposition, but there are certainly people out there calling these people controlled opposition that are themselves controlled opposition. So when someone questions someone else like that, immediately question them. Not just the person that they're pointing their finger at. I think that's the greatest lesson, really, that can be given from this entire series. Question everything, question everyone. And once you've got legitimate and concrete answers that you can trust and you can verify yourself, then start putting your trust in those people. But until then, don't. I have a three-step rule that I live by. 1. If you can verify it yourself and verify it with 2 or 3 other sorts of sources at the same time, retain that information. If it's something that sounds plausible but you can't actually verify yourself, put it to one side until you can. Everything else, throw in the bin, and that applies to everybody. If you do that, you'll be fine. Anyway, on that note, please make sure you look at the description to this video where the link to the group with all the documentation that I've just described is in. And thanks for watching. Right, subscribe, see you later.